Before we move to the statement from the Secretary of State for Health, Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I would like to make a statement on the CAS review of gender identity services for children and young people. And may I say how pleased I am to be joined by parents of children who have been affected by some of the issues raised in this review, and I hope all of us will bear the sensitivities of this debate in mind as we discuss it this afternoon. This review strikes hard and strikes sure at an area of public policy where fashionable cultural values have overtaken evidence, safety and biological reality. This must now stop. As recently as 2009, the NHS's sole gender identity development service at the Tavistock and Portman Trust received fewer than 60 referrals for children and young people and just 15 for adolescent girls. Since then, demand has surged. By 2016, over 1,700 children and young people a year were referred, a 34-fold increase. More than half were teenage girls. In 2022, more than 5,000 children and young people were referred to gender identity clinics, and almost three-quarters were female. Madam Deputy Speaker, this exponential increase in demand is not a coincidence. It has been driven by a number of factors, which I will come on to later, but at its heart, it was driven by a myth. This myth was that for children and young people grappling with adolescence who were questioning their identity, their sexuality, or their path in life, that the answer to their questions was inevitably to change gender, to solve their feelings of unease, discomfort, or distress. And this near-uniform prescription was imposed on children and young people with complex needs without full and thoughtful consideration of their wider needs, including, as is set out in the report, conditions such as neurodiversity, experiences such as childhood trauma, or experiences of mental health conditions, or indeed discovering who it is that they may one day fall in love with. Indeed, the response from some of the people who should have protected them, some of the clinicians in charge of their care at the Tavistock Clinic, was almost always to put them on an irreversible path, blocking puberty, then the prescription of cross-sex hormones, and onto surgery as an adult. In other words, such professionals were not asking the right questions of themselves or of their patients. That is why in 2020, with the support of my predecessors, my right honourable friends, the members for West Suffolk and for Bromsgrove, NHS England commissioned Dr Hilary Cass to examine the state of services for children questioning their gender. And I would like to start by thanking Dr Cass and her team for undertaking a considered, comprehensive and courageous review into an extremely contentious area of healthcare. Since NHS England commissioned the review in 2020, they have unpicked meticulously what went wrong, what the evidence actually shows, and they have recommended how to design a fundamentally different service that better serves the needs of children. But I must also thank those who raised the alarm and contributed to the review over the last 4 years. The clinicians who spoke up against their peers to blow the whistle about what was happening at the Tavistock Clinic, even though it risked their careers. The journalists, academics and activists who listened to their stories and investigated further, even when they were derided as bigots and transphobes. The parents who were just trying their best to support their children, but were so badly let down by a service that vilified them for questioning whether the interventions offered were the right ones for their children. And of course, the young people themselves who have shared their experiences, including those who have gone through the pain of detransitioning, only to find out that the so-called reversible treatments they were offered are not, in fact, reversible. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Cass Review makes for sober reading. It is extremely thorough, and so I will not attempt to cover all of its recommendations today, but I genuinely encourage all honourable and right honourable members to read the report in full. It should concern every single member of this House that part of our public space, the NHS, was overtaken by a culture of secrecy and ideology that was allowed to trump evidence and safety. We say enough is enough. Our young people deserve better, and we must do whatever it takes to protect them. Since the publication of Dr. Cass's interim report in 2022, a series of important changes have been made, and I want to put on record my thanks to NHS England's Chief Executive, Amanda Pritchard, and all of those at NHS England who have worked hard with Dr. Cass to implement these. On the 31st of March, the Tavistock Clinic finally closed, having stopped seeing new patients a year earlier. 2 new regional hubs have been opened in partnership with the country's most prestigious children's hospitals to ensure that children are supported by specialist multidisciplinary teams, and indeed another will follow in Bristol later this year. In the last few weeks, NHS England made the landmark decision to end the routine prescription to children of puberty blockers for gender dysphoria. On the day of publication of Dr. Cass's final report, they announced that they are stopping children under 18 from being seen by adult gender services with immediate effect. And an urgent review on clinical policy for cross-sex hormones will now follow without delay. I also welcome NHS England's plans to bring forward their full review of adult services, including Dr. Cass's recommendation for a follow-through service for young people up to the age of 25. I also share Dr. Cass's concerns that clinicians who subscribe to gender ideology will try to use private providers to get around the rules. Let me give a very clear warning. Prescribing is a highly regulated activity, and the Care Quality Commission has not licensed any gender clinic to prescribe hormone blockers or cross-sex hormones to people under the age of 16. Any clinic that does may be committing extremely serious regulatory offences for which they can have their licence revoked and their clinicians can be struck off. My officials have been in contact with the CQC following the final report to ask that they look again at the age thresholds in their licensing conditions. The CQC has also reassured us that they will incorporate Dr. Cass's recommendations into their safe care and treatment standards for all care providers. This means that all new providers will be asked if their practices respect the Cass review, and all existing providers have to meet the same rigorous standards when they are reviewed by the CQC. My officials met the General Medical Council over the weekend and will do so again in the coming days to understand how they will ensure every clinician on their register follows their code of practice and implements the wider findings of the Cass review. It is morally and medically reprehensible that some online providers not registered in the UK have stated their intention to continue to issue prescriptions to children in this country, and I am looking closely at closing what can be done to curtail any loopholes in prescribing practices, including legislative options. Nothing is off the table, and I will update the House in due course as we progress this work at pace. Dr. Cass also found that there was a lack of robust data on what happened to the 9,000 children who were treated by gender identity services between 2009 and 2020. Many went on to continue their treatment at adult clinics, and the University of York had been due to research the long-term consequences of treatment they received as children so that we can properly support them through their journey into adulthood. It was expected to provide important insights into the clinic's work, including how many patients detransitioned, how many were also diagnosed with a mental health condition or an autism spectrum disorder. We took, this government, the unprecedented step of changing the law to make it possible for adult gender clinics to share medical data with the university. All bar one of the adult gender clinics refused to cooperate with this vital research. This is unacceptable, to quote Dr. Cass. I'd go even further. I think it is deplorable. It is a dereliction of their professional duty. And so I am pleased to update the House that following the publication of Dr. Cass's report, I have been informed that all 7 clinical leads for the adult gender services now intend to fully participate in this important work. Dr. Cass also concludes that a cultural shift alone does not adequately explain the huge growth in young women being referred to gender services. She paints an alarming picture of digitally engaged young women who are frequently exposed to pornography, involving violent, coercive, degrading and pain-inducing acts. Is it any wonder that more and more of them are looking for ways to opt out of becoming women? This is deeply troubling, and as Dr. Cass makes clear, we have a duty to support these young women with considered evidence-based care. Madam Deputy Speaker, our children deserve healthcare that is compassionate, caring and careful. Their safety and well-being must come above any other concern, and anyone who threatens it must be held to account. I will work with NHS England to root out the ideology that has caused so much unnecessary harm, to support those who have already received life-altering treatment, to give the next generation access to holistic care and to protect our children's futures. Anything less would be neglecting our duty to the next generation. This will not happen under this government, and it will not happen under my watch. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State, West Streeting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by thanking the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement, and even more importantly, thanking Dr. Hilary Cass and her team for the thoughtful and thorough way in which they've undertaken their work. She has navigated the complexities and sensitivities of this subject with academic rigour, providing an evidence-led framework for children to receive the best possible healthcare. I also want to pay tribute to journalists like Hannah Barnes and the whistleblowers who together helped shine a light on what was going on at the Tavistock Clinic. At the heart of the complexity around this issue are 2 things which are true simultaneously. There are trans adults in this country who have followed a medical pathway and who say that for all the pain and difficulty that involved, it wasn't just life-affirming, it was life-saving. There are also people in this country who followed a medical pathway who say it was a disaster, that it ruined their lives irreversibly, and they ask how anyone could have let this happen. For the sake of all of those children, young people and now adults, but particularly those being referred into gender identity services today, we have a duty to get this right. What has emerged in the Cass review is a scandal. It is a scandal that children and young people are waiting far too long, often years, for care, while their well-being deteriorates and their childhood slips away. It is scandalous that medical interventions have been made on the basis of shaky evidence. It is scandalous that despite all this, some NHS providers refused to cooperate with Dr. Cass's review. And perhaps the worst scandal of all is that the toxicity of this discussion means that people have felt silenced, and it required investigative journalism to prompt this review taking place. This particularly vulnerable group of children and young people are at the wrong end of all of the statistics for mental ill health, suicide and self-harm. There is no doubt that they have been very badly let down. So we owe it to them to approach this discussion with the same care, and sensitivity with which Dr. Cass undertook her review. There are parts of this report which will sound familiar to anyone acquainted with the NHS today. Children and young people face unacceptably long waiting lists. They are unable to get the mental health support and assessments they require. The services face significant staff shortages, with a lack of workforce planning driving all of it. As with so many parts of the NHS today, this report paints a picture of a service unable to cope with demand. Dr. Cass is clear that care must be personal and holistic. So can the Secretary of State set out how she plans to cut waiting times for assessments for mental health and neurodevelopmental conditions? Waiting lists are so bad in some cases that children are passing into adulthood before they have had their first appointment with gender identity services, leaving them facing a cliff edge. Cass recommends follow-through services up to the age of 25 to ensure continuity of care. Can the Secretary of State provide an indication of how long she thinks it will take to establish these services? Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour welcomed the decision taken by NHS England last month to stop the routine prescription of puberty blockers to under-18s. The loophole that now exists for private providers risks sparking a black market. The Secretary of State has said she expects private clinics to follow the recommendations in this report, indeed to follow the evidence. Can I underline our support for her expectations on compliance? And can she give an indication as to whether she thinks further regulation may be needed to ensure adequate enforcement of the recommendations? Madam Deputy Speaker, the refusal of adult gender services to share data of the long-term experience of patients is inexcusable, as the Secretary of State said, and I agree. It is deplorable. The data does not belong to them. It belongs to the NHS and, crucially, to patients. Of course, I welcome that they are now coming forward, but I also ask the Secretary of State how this was allowed to happen and what accountability she thinks would be appropriate. Madam Deputy Speaker, this report must provide a watershed moment for the NHS's gender identity services. Children's healthcare should always be led by evidence and in the best interests of children's welfare. Dr. Cass's report has provided the basis on which to go forward. The report must also provide a watershed moment for the way in which our society and our politics discuss this issue. There are children and young people in this country and adults, including trans children and young people and adults, who are desperately worried and frightened by the toxicity of this debate. There are healthcare professionals who are scared to do their job and make their views known. And Dr. Cass has said, and I quote, "Toxic, ideological and polarised public debate has made the work of the review significantly harder," and she says it will hamper the research that is essential to finding a way forward. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say that even in this, a general election year, there is surely one issue on which we can down tools and work together, and that is in pursuit of the healthcare of vulnerable people. And can I also pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove? We had many scraps across the dispatch box, but for his role in commissioning this review, he deserves our thanks and respect. And I hope that I can work constructively with the Health Secretary to put children's health and well-being above the political fray.
Chief State.
I welcome all of those who have changed their minds about this critical issue. Because in order to move forward and get on with the vital work that Dr. Cass recommends, we need more people to face up to the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that makes them feel. And so I say to the honourable gentleman opposite me, I hope he has the humility to understand that the ideology he and his colleagues espoused was part of the problem. He talks about the culture and the toxicity of the debate. Does he understand the hurt that he caused to people when he told them to just get over it? Does he know that when he and his friends on the left spent the last decade crying culture wars where legitimate concerns were raised, an atmosphere of intimidation was created and had the impact on the workforce that he has rightly described? They were scared or worried to go into it. And does he now have the good grace to apologise to those who have been maligned in public life, including his own female colleagues, and for the chilling effect that this has had on clinicians, journalists and campaigners who were trying to raise the alarm? I say this because I want to believe the Honourable Gentleman when he says he has turned a corner on this. We now have to start with a new page for the sake not just of the children and young people that we are looking after, but also for the sakes of their families, many of whom will be watching this, living with the consequences of this ideology and this secrecy, wondering how on earth the Honourable Gentleman is talking about general elections, when for them, every single day, every single minute that their children have to live with the treatment they have dealt with, it will never, ever be reversed.
Dame Jackie Doyle-Price.
That was fantastic. Madam Deputy Speaker, this report is clearly very welcome, but has frankly been a long time coming. But one of the issues I'd really like to put to my right honourable friend is really the whole failure of governance that this shows. NHS England's Specialist Commissioning in particular require challenge here, because what was initially commissioned, as she's explained, as a treatment course for a small minority of people has been allowed to expand unchecked and without any consideration of the ethics of what was being done to children. So can she tell me what she's going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again? And secondly, the Tavistock clearly enjoyed the popularity that it was brought to that institution by being at the front end of what was seen as a cutting-edge set of treatments. Frankly, the Governor's allowed that to get in the way of what they should have been doing, which was patient safety. So could she also tell me what she prepares to do about that too?
May I thank my honourable friend who, in her parliamentary career, has done so much to shine a light on this sort of behaviour, but also the worries that she has espoused, both publicly and privately, about the children and young people at the heart of this. So, in terms of what we are looking to the future, the Tavistock Clinic has shut. It stopped, as I say, admitting patients a year ago. These new services that are already in place, the 2 new hubs, but of course the plans to expand further across the country, is about ensuring that we have a multidisciplinary approach to these young people, so that exactly the experiences that Dr. Cass sets out so starkly in her report, all of those conditions are treated so that children are treated as human beings, as patients, not as siloed conditions. One of the main problems that emerged with the Tavistock behaviour and the way that it took place is that gender ideology was, or gender questioning was siloed in a way that no other health or mental health condition was. And we want to move back to a place where clinicians are no longer scared of looking after children and young people with these issues, that they see it as part of their general practice, their general work. That is how we are best going to address the very complex needs of many of these children and young people.
SNP spokesperson Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for advance sight of the statement. Madam Deputy Speaker, nobody's identity should be up for debate, nor should it be used as a political football. Indeed, Dr. Cass said in her report, polarisation and stifling of debate do nothing to help the young people caught in the middle of a stormy social discourse, and in the long run will also hamper the research that is essential to finding the best way of supporting them to thrive. And that polarisation is the last thing needed by young people in accessing care, their families and the NHS staff working hard to care for them. I wonder if the Secretary of State agrees that we must all remain respectful at all times when discussing these important issues, and that decisions on this and any other type of treatment should rightly be made by clinicians and not by politicians. Dr. Cass explicitly makes the point that her report is not about questioning trans identities or rolling back access to healthcare for trans young people. Indeed, supporting and improving the gender identity healthcare system for all, including children and young people, is what we should be focused on. So I wonder if she can confirm today whether any additional funding will be made available to ensure that young trans people can access the quality healthcare that they need and deserve. And finally, on conversion practices, the Government Equalities Office said last month in an answer to a written question that the Government expects to deliver a draft bill that takes account of the independent cash review. So can she provide an update on what conversations she's had with Cabinet colleagues on how the cash review will influence the UK Government's legislative proposals on banning conversion practices and when these are expected to be published?
Secretary of State.
May I urge both the Scottish National Party in Scotland and indeed Labour in Wales, because of course health is devolved in those countries, may I encourage them to respond as quickly as possible to the findings of this review. She asked me whether it's barnetised. For these purposes, our work to ensure that these clinics meet the needs of our population in England is not additional money, but we are reprioritising within NHS budgets to ensure that these services are spread across the country. I would encourage the Scottish Nationalists to prioritise the needs of their children and young people in the same way. I would also gently make the point that when it comes to the atmosphere of this debate, I do not believe it has been helped by the SNP's highly controversial Hate Crime and Public Order Act. And I note, for example, the Twitter behaviour and engagement on Twitter of very, very high-profile people within Scotland and the impact that that has had, where people have dared to name activists in this arena. I would also ask the Labour Party and Scottish Labour Party to explain to us why it is that they helped the SNP pass that act, because to me this is all about the atmosphere.
Chair of the Equalities Committee, Caroline Nokes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Dr Cass's observations around violent and degrading pornography are chilling, and we know the impact that is having not just on young girls, but actually on all our young people. But her recommendations specifically include significant references to expanded services and follow-through services for 17 to 25-year-olds. Can I ask my right honourable friend what concern she has regarding the capacity for that, and what impact that might have for other areas of healthcare? We know that the transition from children's services to adult services can be problematic in a wide range of services, not least for those suffering from body dysmorphia, those suffering from eating disorders. So can my right honourable friend explain whether there might be any crossover where we could see young people then accessing some sort of interim service before the age of 25? And is there going to be more funding committed so that we can see those services, and so that we don't, as all of us will face in our constituencies, see the horror of young people not able to access CAMS services before they turn 18 and then become reliant on adult mental health care?
Well, may I thank my right honourable friend, and she is absolutely right to identify the cohort of young people between the ages of 17 and 25 as being of particular concern now that we have a clear path in relation to the treatment of children and young people under the age of 17. I have now asked NHSE to focus primarily on that next cohort because, again, speaking to parents, one can only get a very real sense of the concerns they have as to the word cliff edge has been used by them, as to the cliff edge between children and young person services and adult services for this very, very vulnerable group of young people. I do not want that to be the case, and so we will see over the coming months work developed by NHSE to help this cohort. But I think she has a sense of just how transformational not just this report with its evidence is, but also the challenges that means that for our health service in England and how we choose to respond to it. In terms of funding, NHS England has committed more than £17 million to the 2 new hubs in this financial year. I hope and expect that our devolved administrations will commit similar sums of money to look after the children and young people in their areas.
Dame Nia Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, she speaks there of the need to have multi-site centres and the fact that 2 hubs have already been put in place. Could you tell us a little bit more about what plans she has to expand to make it multi-site and when that's likely to happen?
Secretary of
Very much so. We have started, as I say, with the 2 sites. We hope to expand to Bristol later this year, and there will be a further 3 or 4 sites across the country of England. However, and this is a really important part of the report, this isn't just about specialist services. This is about giving clinicians the confidence to practice with, to look after children and young people who may well be presenting at their clinics or their surgeries with this as one of a number of conditions. And we want to give them back that confidence and that comfort that they do not have to just go down this narrow pathway of specialist services. Of course, that will be appropriate for many, but we want to treat the whole of the child, not just this particular condition in the way that has happened in the past.
Dr Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first, I must declare my interest as a practising NHS consultant paediatrician, whose practice sometimes involves caring for children with the conditions we've been describing this afternoon. The report is very sobering reading of an example of where ideology has been allowed to trump evidence and safeguarding. And I want to bring the Secretary of State to one particular example, which is where individuals have thwarted attempts of the Cass report to do research into understanding better the outcomes for some children. I'm really pleased to hear they're now cooperating, but we do have a situation where if you look at the letter at the end of the Cass report appended to it from John Stewart, the National Specialised Commissioning Director, he says that the NHS England wrote to all NHS trusts, chief executive and medical directors, and yet still this data was not released. The duties of a doctor, as per the GMC, state that doctors should engage with colleagues to maintain and improve quality and safety of care. So, I ask the Secretary of State, who exactly blocked this data research? What investigation is going to be done to find out who was individually responsible, and how will they individually be held accountable for their actions? How was it possible in the first place for them to do so, and what is she doing to ensure that data cannot be blocked in this way in the future?
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend who brings her clinical expertise and experience into this chamber in this very, very important debate. In terms of the precise questions of who did what when, I hope she'll understand it. I've been working at pace over the last few days with this report. I have asked these questions and I will update the House when I'm in a position to do so. But I would draw the House's attention back to the expectation, not just the moral expectation, but the professional expectation for the medical profession now, in light of this review and the evidence it has produced, is that that clinicians and medical professionals will act in accordance with these recommendations, which will mean that when regulators look at the conduct of medical professionals, they are doing so against this backdrop and against these expectations, so that if there are people who are operating under the misguided apprehension that their ideology trumps this evidence, then I wholly and fully expect the regulators to crack down on that.
I am very anxious to make sure that everybody can get in, because I know it's an important statement, but we do need to make sure that the questions are brief, so the Secretary of State is able to be brief in response. We do have a big debate on the Miranda Bill, followed by another debate on the hospice movement, and I'm sure that many of those colleagues will be wanting to participate in those as well. So perhaps if we can just bear that in mind in thinking of the questions. Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for her thoughtful and considered statement on the Cass review, especially in mentioning the journalists such as my friend Hannah Barnes, who blew the whistle on the Tavistock Clinic. As she says, those who've raised this issue over the last few years, desperately concerned about the safeguarding of vulnerable children and young people, too young to make life-changing decisions, are owed a heartfelt apology for being no-platformed, ghosted, sidelined and disciplined at the behest of a few extreme groups of activists, some within political parties. Does she agree that academics, politicians, writers, psychologists, actors and anyone questioning their workplaces signing up to Stonewall law have now been vindicated by Dr. Cass's expert review? And does she agree that they should be apologised to?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I come to the dispatch box with huge admiration for the Honourable Lady, for the commitment she and others on the Labour backbenchers have shown, even though they were doing so in a culture and an atmosphere where their views were demeaned, they were sneered at, they were castigated for so doing. Indeed, I hear rumours that there were efforts made to remove certain members from the party itself. This is why, this is the moment now for apologies, for humility, but also for us to start with a clean page and ensure that when perfectly reasonable questions are asked about the medical treatment of our children, those questions are allowed to be asked in an atmosphere of respect and understanding so that these very, very vulnerable children and young people are looked after in a caring and careful way.
Miriam Cates.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I warmly welcome the Cass Review and its findings and an extraordinarily strong statement from my right honourable friend. I've no doubt that what happened at GIDS will go down as one of the worst safeguarding and medical scandals of our generation. But I want to pay tribute to the very brave parents, including those in the Bayswater support group, who have been raising concerns about this for years, raising concerns about the ethics and the safety of putting vulnerable children on irreversible and unevidenced medical pathways to achieve something that can never be achieved, which is to change their sex. But those who spoke up for the interests of children, and frankly for the interests of common sense, were labelled bigots, transphobes and even fascists. And even after those concerns were raised and Dr Cass was commissioned, the Tavistock was allowed to continue to practice, which was a shocking suspension of the precautionary principle. This scandal happened because too many adults put their own desire for social approval above the safety of vulnerable children. How can we make sure that that does not happen again?
Well, as my honourable friend was asking that question, there were people on the benches opposite tutting her. And that shows that whilst some understand the need to keep this debate about the clinical and compassionate needs of these children, there are still people on the benches opposite who don't get it. And the idea that the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, for example, would sign a charter in 2020 describing bodies like the Women's Place UK, which campaigns, dare I say it, for single-sex rape refugees, something that the House knows I have an enormous commitment to, that apparently is trans-exclusionist hate groups. That sort of language is the language that needs to be apologised for so that we can all move on, because we are expecting clinicians, we are expecting medical professionals to do the right thing by this report and by our children and young people. There needs to be some leadership from all of us in public life to ensure that we are setting the right examples to those people.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. At its heart, the Cass report, sadly, highlights the lack of care or the low standard of care for our young people. That they were caught up in a toxic debate, there were long waiting lists, and indeed that debate seeped into the staffing of the medical profession. So would the Secretary of State agree with me now that we have to look at the well-being of our children, look at it holistically, and could she tell us how she's going to overcome the recruitment problems and the staffing problems that have been created by this toxic debate?
May I thank the Honourable Lady, if I may say so, someone else, actually, who has an exemplary record of campaigning on this. This comes down to the very, very careful review that Dr Cass has herself written. We have to get away from this idea that if a child presents with gender distress, that is the only part of their health that we care about, that we look into. Of course not. We have to look across the board to ensure that we are looking after every single part of them, and also not assuming that medical pathways are the only and inevitable pathway for them. I think one of the problems and one of the concerns that have been raised about the terrible, terrible mental health that many children and young people suffer in this report is that wasn't being looked after. They were just put on these drugs and expected to get on with it, if you like. And that is wrong, and we are determined to change that.
Paul Bristow.
Deputy Speaker, what was the Secretary of State's reaction to the news that almost all gender clinics refuse to cooperate with the CAS review? And does she agree that this is a too important issue for a circle the wagons attitude? What can she do to ensure that government guidance is followed to the letter and in spirit when we tackle a gender ideology that seems to be running rampant through our public institutions?
Yeah. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not about my emotions, but I can tell the honourable gentleman I was disgusted and I was angry. And what is more, to me, this is about our public space. Our public space being able to have these conversations, and if, for example, a part of our public institutions, whether it's NHS, schools or whatever, are asked to respond to a very, very thoughtful and careful review such as this, then of course they must do so, because this information doesn't belong to them, it belongs to their patients, it belongs to future patients, because we want to shape the services to help them, and it belongs to us as a nation. And so for me, the welcome about turn that they were now going to provide this data happened. I'm pleased it's happened, but my goodness me, I wish they'd done it earlier.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. All trans children and young people deserve access to high-quality, timely healthcare and support. There are around 100 studies that have not been included in this CAS report, and we need to know why. The Minister obviously is not concerned about the way the CAS report has been used to perpetuate a broader hostile environment towards trans people in the UK, created in part by the government's delay to the GRA. Misrepresenting the report, and this high and mighty attitude from the Minister helps no one. Will the Minister commit to extra funding needed to help young people have a holistic approach to their healthcare pathway?
So I'm not quite clear whether the Honourable Lady supports this report or is castigating it. I have no idea whether she supports it or not. What is interesting, however, is that we are trying, with this review, a very thorough review, a very thoughtful review, those are the words of her front bench spokesman, that with this review we are trying to use this evidence to help clinicians treat our young people and children in a compassionate, caring way. That I've noticed, and I've had it reported to me by others who have been watching this, that certain campaigners are trying to build up a head of steam that this report is somehow flawed. It is not. This is superb evidence, and we are asking, and the NHS has assured us they're going to be acting on it.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The CAS review highlights the deterioration in mental health in young people. It particularly highlights the impact of social media, putting awful pressures on young people. The mental health crisis is obviously in both boys and girls, but particularly, as she highlighted earlier, in girls and young women. Will the Secretary of State continue to turbocharge and give CAMS crisis teams the resources they desperately need to support our young people?
May I thank my friend for his question. We want to help not just with crisis support, but to help prevent our young people from getting into the position of crisis in the first place. And so we are rolling out mental health support teams ahead of our schedule, actually, across schools. That's a really important piece of work that will be helping already, we think, 44% of the student population. We want to, of course, go even further. And we have increased the number of children and young people aged under 18 through NHS-funded mental health services from the 12-month period ending the March 2021 to some 758,000 children. Of course, we want that support to be there, both in the community, but also, importantly, to help clinicians understand that this is just one of several sets of conditions that they should have confidence to work on to look after the child holistically.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker. Given the vile campaigns which are directed towards anyone who disagrees with the transgender lobby, I think that we should congratulate Dr. Cass and her team for having the courage to make the report which they have made. And also, I've got to say to the Minister today for her robust defence of that report as well. Given in light of the report and given the fact that it seems that the transgender lobby has infiltrated the NHS in England, what steps is she taking to purge that lobby from the NHS? And also, what discussions has she had with ministers in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales to ensure that the same policies and practices are not carried out in the public and private sectors there?
Can I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the reason I'm able to be so robust on this is because I believe it. I believe it. And so this, which may be different from others, the challenge that he rightly puts, though, to NHS England is that we have to ensure that it is acting as an organisation, but also at an individual and local level, to implement the evidence and the reforms that this report recommends. I want to be fair, to clinicians, medical professionals, managers, and others who very much support this review, and so I want to help support them bring about the recommendations, and issues as to what individual clinicians may or may not have done in the past will be a matter for both NHS England but also regulators going forward. The moral and the professional expectation is that in future, clinicians, medical professionals, all of us will respect the evidence and the recommendations of this important report.
Angela Richardson. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to put on record my thanks to Dr Hilary Cass for her thoughtful and comprehensive review. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that those of us across this House who for the last few years have been calling for a pause to wait for Cass because of concerns, not with the L, the G, the B, but the T element of the banning of the conversion therapy, does she believe that we have been completely vindicated in our call?
Yeah. Well, again, may I thank my honourable friend very sincerely for her help in raising these difficult questions and doing so, as she has just demonstrated, in a very thoughtful and careful manner. I know she shares my concern that the children and young people at the heart of this should be our focus, and that we need to build the system around them rather than them being slotted into the system as has happened in the past. In terms of conversion therapy, and again I'm being very, very mindful of the sensitivities of this, we are committed to supporting all victims of conversion practices, but we do want to avoid any unintended consequences and ensure that the draft bill takes account of the independent Cass review. And so that is why my Cabinet counterpart, Minister for Women and Equalities, is leading the work in this area and very much considering this very complex issue as part of our approach to this sensitive and important matter.
Antonia Atzi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The starting point of all modern medicine must be robust and reliable evidence, in fact rigorous. Back in 2017 I put in a written question because at the request of my trans constituent, they were concerned that many adults and young people were putting themselves through a process and it wasn't the right one for them. That was 2017, Secretary of State. And we still haven't had much better data, and the data is the most important thing that we know that informs everything. There has been a chilling effect in this chamber. There has been a chilling effect on social media for people that have spoken out, that have asked questions like that. Questions you ask for everyday healthcare, and we have denied that, and the government has denied that for the children in our care. So please, Secretary of State, the member for Ilford North has been fantastic. He has shown great maturity and reflection on his comments in the chamber and in the media. So has the Secretary of State. But please, from one that has been at the other end of this, to the Secretary of State, let's absolutely get the tone right of this debate and let's absolutely move forward. The Cass report is a great thing. We have to work with it to deliver the best outcomes for the children in our care.
Well, again, I approach the dispatch box with humility because I know the journey and the debates and the questions that she has put forward, not just on behalf of that particular constituent, but on the wider issue of women and the treatment of women within healthcare, but also other parts of public life. I very much want us to view the future as a clean sheet so that we can build the services around the children, as I say, rather than expecting them to slot in to the convenience of some of the arguments that have been put forward in the past. But there is, and I think we have to acknowledge this has been such a long and toxic debate that there will be people who want answers. And I appreciate the fact that the honourable gentleman opposite has walked back some of his comments, but I do think it is important we acknowledge the toxicity so that we can move on and achieve exactly what she and I and others around the chamber, and interestingly, the people opposite are now, they're now chanting from a sedentary position. Interesting that I think we can make a real change, but a little less sniping from the sidelines, a little more constructive work is what is needed.
Nick Fletcher.
Deputy Speaker, I have called out this ideology locally and here in Westminster with colleagues at every opportunity available to me. At last, it appears the world is waking up to this issue. Sadly, we know of at least 9,000 children who have been affected by this scandal, possibly damaged for life. So firstly, I ask the Minister if she will establish a public inquiry into this issue. Secondly, alongside reforms to the NHS, we must re-establish safeguarding in schools. Will the Minister liaise with the education colleagues to fix our statutory safeguarding guidance, keeping children safe in education? This currently downplays the risk factor around a child identifying as trans. It must be addressed. And finally, I believe there are many bad actors who have paddled this nonsense, clearly knowing what they were doing, while destroying our young people's lives. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe if there is any justice, these individuals should feel the full weight of the law. I hope they are quaking in their boots. They ought to be.
Well, may I thank my honourable friend for his powerful intervention just now and his question. I'm going to deal, if I may, with the point about public inquiry, because I know there are some who are asking whether that would be appropriate. I hope, will he take it from me that what I'm trying to do at the moment, bearing in mind that the report landed less than a week ago, I am determined to drive forward the actions that are needed on the ground to help children and young people. I think actually we've had a 4-year review into this. You know, Dr. Cass has gathered a great deal of evidence. It is a very, very thorough review. And so for the moment, I want to concentrate on implementing these recommendations and on ensuring that the services are brought up to the standards he rightly understands. And on his second point, of course, I will liaise with my right honourable friend in education. Again, this is about helping all public sector professionals ensure that they are acting on the evidence as set out in the Cass review for the sake of our children and young people.
Joanna Cherry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I warmly welcome this statement? It's not something she will often hear from me. But as she said, the Cass report has vindicated the concerns of many whistleblowers, including feminists and LGBT activists who warned of the consequences for children of unevidenced medical interventions and the ideological capture of the NHS. Now, for doing so, we, and because I was part of this, we were defamed and hounded by organisations that many of us had formerly supported, like Stonewall, Mermaids, Pink News, who I had to sue for defamation, and the misnamed Equality Network in Scotland. Now, to their shame, members of this House and members of the other place joined in this bullying and groupthink. So while I hear what she has to say about a public inquiry and about her immediate focus being on implementing the recommendations, it does seem to me that we do need a public inquiry into how this institutional capture happened in our public bodies. And as we all know, it's not just the NHS, because we need to make sure that never again do ideologues of any sort or science deniers take hold of our public institutions. So when she's done with implementing the recommendations, or as she's doing that, will she support the movement for a public inquiry into these matters?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious I've just answered that, but can I also put on record my thanks and my respect for everything that the Honourable Lady has done in this field. She has, at times, had to walk a very, very lonely path, and I find it, Madam Deputy Speaker, extraordinary that parliamentarians elected by our constituents to represent the best interests of our constituents and indeed of our countries would find themselves under that sort of pressure for simply stating biological fact. And so I hope she will be working with me to ensure that the recommendations that are in the Cass review are applied not just in England, but in Scotland, in Wales, and I know in Northern Ireland as well.
Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome this report and also very much welcome the very strong statement by the Secretary of State in response to it. If there is one thing that should be above party politics, that should be above political ideology, that should be above cultural trends or virtue signalling, it should be the welfare of our young people. And this report lays bare that, sadly, that is exactly what has been happening. But this ideology is not only captured part of our NHS, it is found in many of our public sector institutions. So can I ask the Secretary of State, who has clearly taken a very strong leadership position on this today, if she will ensure that across government that the findings of this report are implemented in education, in local government, in social services, in our police force, to ensure that this can never happen again?
Thank my honourable friend and say to him that I view this, sorry, I'm not using a prop, I apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, but this report sets out the evidence. The evidence was not there before. It has taken 4 long years of very, very hard work to gather it. It is now there, and I hope and expect certainly that the health sector will implement these recommendations, but also actually that we can have a conversation about our wider public space. And I'm very, very pleased to read over the weekend the article by my Ministerial Cabinet colleague, the Minister for Women and Equalities. I do think we have got to depoliticise the public space and ensure that these principles, this evidence, is applied across the board for the health of all of our constituents and our country.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Thank you very much. Look, I welcome any research and this report that moves the debate forward. My reading of Cass is that she says there was a toxic debate on both sides, that there were people particularly nasty and vicious on all sides. I've had posters put out outside my house with rude words on them, etc., etc. It has happened on all sides. That's what Cass says, that it is unhelpful. She says it seems to be little evidence that there is large numbers of regret, but there is little evidence on large numbers of success either. There is poor evidence of effectiveness. There needs to be more evidence on the usefulness of social transition. To me, I read it, that there needs to be an awful lot of more evidence. But what she's clear is that young people shouldn't be denied access to healthcare if they are trans. In fact, they should have more healthcare and more pathways. So will the Minister agree to fund research into this, not just getting the evidence from adult services, but proper research, longitudinal studies that can mean that we are evidence-based? And will the government support an amendment that would be Cass compliant to my conversion practices bill that I believe can square this circle?
I'm sorry, but there is, I think, a certain amount of disbelief in the chamber, because I cannot be the only one who remembers the debate of January 2023, where the member opposite not only tried to shout down female colleagues on his side of the House, but felt so exercised about the debate, which was the to do with, I should say, the Scottish Gender Recognition Act. He crossed the floor of the House to come and sit on the bench next to my honourable friend for Penistone and Stocksbridge. And I remember just how those of us on this side of the House were genuinely surprised that a member of Parliament would think it was appropriate to behave in that way when debating something that we are entitled and should feel free to debate. So I'm sorry to hear that he has suffered the abuse he describes, but setting a good example starts at home, and I hope he won't ever behave as he did in the chamber that day, because that's how we sort out this toxicity of debate.
Douglas Ross.
Deputy Speaker, the response from the Scottish Government to the Cass Review has been one of deafening silence. In fact, SNP ministers have buried their head in the sand and said nothing at all proactively about the review or its conclusions and recommendations. Indeed, the Scottish Conservative request to have a statement in the Scottish Parliament about the Cass Review has so far been refused by the SNP Green Government. So I welcome the opportunity to be able to speak about it here in the UK Parliament. The Minister mentioned in her statement the recent decision by NHS England to end the routine prescription of puberty blockers to children. However, that is still available in Scotland. Can I ask her what discussions she has had, have there been any, with Scottish Government ministers and the UK Government on this issue, or indeed between officials in NHS Scotland and NHS England?
May I thank my honourable friend for his careful and considered question on this. I very much hope that the Scottish National Government will look at the evidence into this very carefully and find the recommendations to their liking. As I say, it is to NHS England's credit that they have acted so promptly, and I would hope and expect that the devolved nations led by the Scottish National Party and indeed the Labour Party in Wales will follow with similar speed. I do note, however, and I've had to refer to it because I'm afraid it is in line with the atmosphere in which clinicians are having to operate, this Hate Crime and Public Order Act brought forward by the Scottish National Government, supported by Scottish Labour, cannot help with the considered debate that we wish to have about this very, very complex subject. And I would encourage them to look at that as part of their overall approach to this.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I welcome the Cass Review and I welcome her recommendations. Mistakes have been made that must never happen again. But the polarised public debate she mentions reflects badly on this House. So does the Minister agree that making jokes about trans people and trans children is cruel and cheapens the debate and moves the focus away from ensuring that all of our young people get the help they need when they need it?
Well, it isn't simply... True leadership is not just about being careful about the words we use, and I'm not going to recite many of the words that, for example, the other members of the Labour Party have used about trans issues and the fact they say, for example, that I think the cervix is... No, I'm not mentioning a member, but it's factually inaccurate to say only women had a cervix. I mean, that seems an extraordinary thing for a member of the party opposite that wants to... They don't like hearing their words back at them, Madam Deputy Speaker. They don't like it. But I'm going to resist that temptation, and instead I'm going to focus on the application of policy. And when we look at, for example, the treatment of trans prisoners, including those who are fully intact and who have been convicted of serious sexual offences, demanding to be held in prisons that match their chosen gender, it is this government, me as Prisons Minister, but many of my predecessors as well, who set clear rules to ensure that the sorts of situations we saw, such as the Karen White scenario, is not repeated. And so it was very, very troubling that members opposite did not appear to have those same concerns when it came to the placing of a trans double rapist, Isla Bryson, in Scotland. I'm being told it's not true. If they want to fact check, apparently it was the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party who said it doesn't matter.
Sir William Cash.
Mr. Speaker, I fear that although I would like to believe that many of these problems will be resolved by guidance and by changing administrative rules and things of that kind, I fear that actually the real problem is a much deeper one. This is about the manner in which successively over the last generation we have actually brought in legislation which has facilitated these arrangements, and I'm so glad that the government has put through the Online Safety Bill, which deals with platforms where a lot of this stuff has been spuriously put out by people who have absolutely no moral compass whatsoever. Could I simply say, you will not resolve this, if I may say so, to the Secretary of State, and I want to thank her for what she said this afternoon and the manner in which she's done it. Not only robust, but extremely effective. But please do not believe that this is going to be resolved just by changes in rules and administration. This is about moral compass. It is also about telling the truth. And it's also, at the same time, about making certain that the legislation, whether it's the Equalities Act or whether it is related to human rights or whatever other legislation is required, will need to be changed, including the online safety.
Order, we really can't, I want to get everybody in, but we really can't have sort of mini speeches. It's questions to the Secretary of State, so the Secretary of State can answer them briefly.
Madam Deputy, the brevity of my answer demonstrates my respect for my right honourable friend's observations and experience. I completely agree with him, and I will enjoy working with him on this.
Excellent. Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for her very important statement today, and I welcome every word of it, as I do the Cass report, the final report. And I thank Dr Hilary Cass for her outstanding work in lifting the lid on this dangerous ideology and its impact on predominantly young LGBT but other gender non-conforming young people. The Secretary of State made a really important point, and that was the insinuation of gender ideology and its impact on the health service. But we know, and other members have made this point, that gender ideology has insinuated itself into many of our public bodies and insinuated itself into debate in this place. And there are pieces of legislation being proposed in this place that would actually legislate to enforce the very conditions in the Cass report, where gender non-conforming and other young people are denied proper psychological and psychosocial support to come to a reasonable discussion and endpoint. What support will the Secretary of State give to have that conversation to wheedle out this ideology elsewhere?
May I thank the honourable gentleman for his advocacy on this issue, and I very much hope that all members of the House will be able to use the evidence produced in this review and report in future debates about legislation, so that we can all make informed and the correct decisions on legislation.
Llanelli. Mr. Speaker, let's be honest, Secretary of State, what this very excellent review does is actually expose institutionalised grooming and abuse by so-called professional medical people. What is she going to do now to make sure that those people who are pushing this from day one are now going to minimum be on the sex offenders list and actually be taken off being able to practice as medical people?
May I thank my honourable friend and near neighbour. If I may, I think that in fact she's right, and indeed my right honourable friend for Stone is right, to emphasise it's not just the debate within the NHS, it's also actually the debate of what happens online as well, because I know that parents of children affected by this are very, very aware of the online, as they describe it, grooming of children on social media. I don't want to trespass for the time being on the regulators. As I say, we've already had some very constructive conversations with the regulators, but the will of the House is clear that we expect the report to be followed and for clinicians to act on the basis of that evidence.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by saying I welcome Cass Review's findings, making it clear that clinical services must be led by good quality, robust evidence, also highlighting the lack of and poor quality data and the need. We all know the important role that data plays in terms of delivering for patients. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that the review of adult gender services should take into account the number of patients with mental health challenges such as depression, anxiety, autism, self-harm, eating disorders and many others, and what additional resources will be put in place for mental health provision?
May I thank the Honourable Lady for her thoughtful question, because she's right to list just some of the mental health conditions that both Dr Cass but also professionals in this area have realised can be part of the complex needs of children and young people, asking questions of their identity and about their path in life. In terms of funding, the financial value of the contract last year with the Tavistock was 9.3 million, but for this financial year, NHS England has committed some £17.1 million for the 2 new hubs for gender services, and of course they will keep this under review as we build up the services across the country in the ways envisaged in the report.
Richard Fuller.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I add my thanks to Dr Hilary Cass for her review and say that having listened to this Secretary of State today, I am confident that young people in this situation are in safe hands as she implements the recommendations in the Cass report. But I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, about accountability. Because what we've seen within the NHS for previous scandals, whether it's contaminated blood or Mid-Staffordshire, that accountability is a little slippery about the NHS. Accountability is not just about lessons being learnt. It's about people being held to account for what they have done. So will my right honourable friend advise me, will she be looking at ways in which there is room here for people, if found to be wrong, to be struck off, for managers to be sacked, and in certain circumstances for criminal actions to be taken?
May I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I completely understand his desire for accountability. I would just remind all of us that, of course, there are some clinicians who have acted in an exemplary, a morally exemplary way, trying to blow the whistle on the practices they observed. What he and I hope others want to do is to ensure that those clinicians who have not acted in accordance with their professional duties, that they are held to account. As I say, there are ongoing conversations with the independent regulators, but again, I suspect they have very much got the understanding of the way in which the House is viewing this and the seriousness with which we view those clinicians that have not abided by their professional duties in this regard.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of the recommendations of the Cass review are to be welcomed. However, there has been some dangerous misinterpretation of some of the recommendations in public discourse, and crucially, in the response by the NHS England to recommendations for transitional services for 17 to 25-year-olds. So will the Minister join me in challenging the NHS specialised commissioning team on the immediate limit of access to support to 17-year-olds, including cancellation of appointments for some who have waited years, and calling on them to immediately reinstate access while they review next steps?
I think the Honourable Lady, and forgive me if I've misunderstood her question, I think she's asking me, she's referring to the decision that the NHS England will prevent under 18s from accessing adult gender services. There is a referral, there's a consultation open at the moment, it's just closed. We're looking at the results of that, but I am very, very sensitive to the needs of, as I say, young people within that 17 to 25 cohort who, for them, the cliff edge, as it's been described to me, of moving from children's services to adult services may not, in fact, be in their best interests. And so I promise that is very much the focus of my work in this in the weeks ahead.
Julie Moss.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My experience of speaking with my constituents on this subject has been characterised by fear. Fear often, I have to be honest, from mothers about their daughters, and I have to say that it's fear of what's happening to their children, but also the fear of speaking out because of the groupthink and the toxicity around the debate. Does my right honourable friend agree that Dr Cass's extensive evidence-based report should mark an absolute turning point in ensuring that it's children first, non-ideological, that should be spearheading our approach to this debate in all areas, across government, in all government departments, not just the NHS, in education and in our public bodies?
May I thank my honourable friend sincerely, and she again articulates the concerns of many families for whom a teenager or young person in the family may be suffering very complex needs, and they are asking questions of themselves and their place in society. We must treat not just the child or the young person, but also the family with care, with respect, and try to support them to get to the right place for their child.
Chiomura.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Constituents have contacted me who see in the Cass report a vindication of their long-held views on sex and gender following years of abuse, sometimes violent. Others have contacted me who fear that the Cass review represents an attack on their very existence as trans people and fear the abuse to come. Would the Secretary of State set out that she opposes utterly the toxification and politicisation of questions of sex and gender? Will she also set out that she will collect the evidence, the additional evidence that the Cass review calls for, without which there cannot be an evidence-based approach, and also that she will put in place the resources that our young people need in terms of healthcare to ensure that they receive the healthcare appropriate to them?
Well, may I thank the Honourable Lady actually for giving me the opportunity to make it clear again that this is about this report is about gathering the evidence to help support our children and young people to the best care they can have. For a very, very small number, that may well be a medical pathway, but for the overwhelming majority, we know from the Dr. Cass report that in fact there may be other ways in which they can be best supported and looked after. And also, I do not want anyone to walk away from this debate thinking that for those adults who have made that decision, of their own free will, who are living their lives as freely as we all want them to, that this is somehow a report about them. This is not. This is about the healthcare, the emotional care and support that we give to young people, their families, and also the professional confidence we give to clinicians to ensure that we get to the right place for each and every individual child.
Anna Firth.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State's made a very powerful statement today, which I welcome absolutely, and the Cass report. But we do have to acknowledge that without this government commissioning this report with support from other parties, this would not have happened, because so many on that side of the chamber just stayed silent and thought this report was pretty much a waste of time. And to see the lack of any appreciation of that today is shocking and shameful. But the important points I wanted to ask was the timetable to enact the wider findings of the Cass report. I'm very grateful for what she said about meeting the GMC over the weekend, but there clearly needs to be some work to be done there. And secondly, and really concerningly, what steps are we putting...
Order. I'm sure the Honourable Lady doesn't mean secondly, because she's not actually making a speech. She has one question to ask, and I'll be grateful if she would just ask one question, please.
Steps, the emotional and psychological support for those who've already undergone this treatment with irrevocable consequences. What are we going to do for them, please?
Yes, well, may I thank my honourable friend. In terms of her observations about other parts of the chamber and their response to this are well made, frankly. But in terms of the gosh, I'm being told they're not true. Crikey, they may have just opened up a bit of a Pandora's box on this. The point she makes about supporting people who have gone through this process and who are trying to detransition, she is absolutely right that they need particular care, and I'm actively looking into what NHS England needs to provide in order to look after these very, very complex needs that such people have.
Ben Bradshaw.
Has she seen today's very sad interview with Judge Victoria MacLeod, Britain's only senior transgender judge, who has been driven from her job because of anti-trans hate, and particularly the trend among some politicians and opinion formers to describe being transgender as an ideology? She has used the term ideology, as have a number of her colleagues, during this statement. Could you please clarify, for the benefit of this House and trans people, that she does not believe being transgender is an ideology?
I genuinely thank the honourable gentleman for giving me the chance to re-emphasise that. When I've talked about ideology, it is the ideology influencing the provision of services, the assumption that any child or young person who is questioning their place, questioning their sexuality, questioning their identity and their future path in life, the ideology is that influenced those services which Dr. Cass has set out so very very well. But of course, if an adult chooses to live their life in a transgender, as a transgender adult, then they must do so, and they must do so freely. And I would hope also with compassion and understanding from all of us, because I have always said, by the way, I've been talking about this now for many years. When I was Minister for Women, I talked about this. We must deal with this issue in a caring and careful way, and that is what Dr. Cass emphasises in her report.
Robin Miller.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome this statement. The Cass report highlights the error of prescribing untested and irreversible drugs as puberty blockers to young people. But in Wales, the pathway for young people diagnosed with gender dysphoria includes referral to gender services in England. The Cass report also warns against teachers being forced into making premature and effectively clinical decisions about affirmation, such as social transitioning, and yet this is implicit throughout the Welsh Government's own LGBTQ+ action plan and their compulsory relationships and sexuality education curriculum. Does she agree that these findings then have relevance for the safeguarding of children in England and in Wales? And does she agree that parents, teachers and health workers across England and Wales can expect politicians to take heed of these findings?
I very much agree with my honourable friend. He's always very, very good, if I may say so, at exposing some of the differences in treatment that patients in Wales receive compared to treatment of patients in England. I hope and expect that the Labour Party will be true to its word, given that the leader of the Labour Party has said that Wales is the blueprint for how they would plan to run the NHS in England. I hope and expect that the Labour-run NHS in Wales will be announcing their immediate adoption of these recommendations and the transformation to services that we in England are already undertaking.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of us recognise the value of the Cass report, as my colleague from Brighton set out, in its call for evidence, its call for a thoughtful approach, its recognition that the collapse of CAMS has contributed to the difficulties of children accessing services. But I stand here today with constituents who have contacted me terrified, and they are part of the group who are in the backlog, and I dare say thousands of those children have been watching this debate with their families and are frightened to hear the heat, not light. Now, I know the Secretary of State has a brief in front of her. Can I ask her a very practical question for my constituents who do not understand what this will mean for waiting times and delays? She said earlier she wasn't putting any new money in, it was being reprioritised. In practical terms, what will it mean for those young people trying to navigate what's happening to them, who need our support and care, not our derision in any political movement, next?
So I'll refer the Honourable Lady to the answer I gave earlier about funding. In relation to the waiting list, it is precisely because we are removing the single provider of these services from the Tavistock. We've done that already. We have now set up 2 sets of services in highly, highly respected, world-respected children's hospitals, and we will add more. But again, this goes back to giving GPs and other practitioners the confidence to look after these children as they would if they were presenting solely with, for example, ADHD symptoms or concerns about mental health conditions. This is about saying this is one part of the patient that they must treat, not isolating it and siloing it in the way that has happened historically.
Alexander.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Prescribing hormone blockers to children is wrong. Encouraging and giving cross-sex hormones to children is wrong, and encouraging breast binding for children is wrong. And I believe we'll look back on this scandal, and this is a scandal in the last few decades in the future, with incredulity of how we did this to our children and especially our girls. We should all be embarrassed that this is the situation that we're in. But it's not just carrying on our hospitals and medical profession. This sort of ideology is going on in our schools. Does the Secretary of State share my concerns and many of my constituent concerns who have raised it with me, but in private, because they cannot say this publicly, that a school in Rother Valley is fundraising for mermaids, a charity that is accused of encouraging young people to transition simply because they do not conform to gender stereotypes, even though they are too young to understand the consequences? Does the Secretary of State share my belief that mermaids and other such charities have no place in our education school and no place to help to hinder our children?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I'll just, if I may, just set out the practical steps NHS England has already taken, because this is important, and as I say, I hope other parts of the United Kingdom will follow. NHSE has banned the prescription of puberty blockers for gender dysphoria to children under the age of 18 years old. For cross-sex hormones, they can only be prescribed at the moment with extreme caution for 16-year-olds and older. That is on the advice of Dr. Cass, and no cross-sex hormones may be prescribed to under 16-year-olds for gender dysphoria. There are, of course, medical caveats to that for other medical conditions, and we need to be very careful of unintended consequences, which is why this is such a complicated piece of work. But we want to ensure that these drugs are prescribed to the right people, if indeed they should be prescribed at all. His point about campaigning organisations, again, this is part of, I think, our collective frustration that our public spaces have become politicised, and that there is, I would say, there is no space for that sort of campaign activity in any of our public institutions. I appreciate, of course, a range of views must be represented. People must be helped. Young people must be helped to discover, as I say, their path in life, their sexuality, all of the things that is such a wonderful part of growing up. But we have to do so in a way that is fair, that is rigorous, and that does not give way against the evidence into the realms of ideology, which sadly we have seen in some instances.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you very much. I do welcome the CAS review, and the recommendations merit proper and full consideration. Dr Cass herself has called for trans young people, their families and clinicians to be treated with respect and compassion. And sadly, I don't think we have seen that today in terms of some of the comments and indeed some of the heckles that have been made during this session. Will the Minister commit to challenging the harmful culture of transphobia in the UK, which is growing, and indeed which was challenged in 2022 by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, placing the UK alongside Russia, Hungary and Turkey?
If the honourable gentleman wants to work constructively with me on ensuring that we deal with this report, we deal with the evidence in a caring and careful way for the benefit of children and young people, but also the wider trans community, I will welcome his support in so doing.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While I welcome Dr Cass's call for all young people, including young trans people, to be, and I quote, treated with compassion and respect, I share concerns about important elements of the review, particularly given the context in which it was published. Last year, transphobic hate crimes hit a record high. A United Nations report noted deep concern about the increase in harassment, threats and violence against LGBT people in the UK, and blamed the toxic debate about sexual orientation and gender identity. So will the Minister join me in condemning the rise in transphobia, in acknowledging that trans rights are human rights, and in recognising that we will only deliver high-quality healthcare that everyone deserves when we respect the rights and dignity of all?
Well, not only have I tried to espouse those principles in every ministerial role that I've held, but it is also the guiding light of this government that we want to ensure that we get the right healthcare and support to patients as quickly as possible. We also want to ensure that we're treating not just the condition, but we're treating the patient as a whole. And as some of the complexity of the debates that we've had this afternoon shows, the young people at the very heart of this, and I think this is the final question, Madam Deputy Speaker, so I'm going to end with the young people that we're concerned about. Oh, I'm so sorry, I've got one more go. But the children and the young people that we that are the focus of this report have to be and will be the focus of our work going forward. We want to get the right services to the right children in the right time.
No, I wouldn't like to say that the Secretary of State would ever be wrong, but on us judgment, the show is never over until the member for Strangford has spoken.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. You're most kind, and I know the Secretary of State already knows that anyway. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for her fortitude, for her determination, and for Dr Cass for all of her endeavours. Both ladies, honourable ladies, I believe, have been incredibly impressive and very capable. Dr Cass's report is one that we should be taking on board for Northern Ireland. Indeed, I will make it my business Madam Deputy Speaker, to ensure that the Minister takes this in, and I'll send him a copy of the report as well. What help and support is available for all of those patients in Tavistock from its inception? And importantly, what steps can be taken by government to stop this malpractice, and what some have described as tantamount to abuse of the vulnerable from moving into private funded abuse, and how quickly can protection be put in place? Thank you.
My sincere apologies to the honourable gentleman. I'm out of practice. I should have known he'd be the last question. I genuinely look forward to working with my Northern Irish counterparts on this, and as we have worked on other matters already. The point he makes about private practices, this is one of the areas that I'm working on at pace, because what we don't want is to have any idea forming that somehow people can get round, if you like, the NHS rules, very strict rules that they are setting the system in order to get these drugs to young people and children. I will come back, I've made this promise, I will come back and update the House when I have more news on that, but he is right to identify that, and it shows perhaps the complexity and the real need for detail, and also a very clear principled approach to this issue in order to help reform our NHS to make it faster, simpler and fairer.
Thank you. That does now conclude proceedings on the statement. Point of order, Mr. Gavin Newland.